This time it's 5 classic Italian 250s. In stark contrast to the American industry with its long roads and big capacity cruisers, the Italian industry grew up around building small capacity, highly manoeuvrable, sporty little bikes. The capacities of 150, 175 and 250 were extremely popular in the industry at this time. So here are 5 classic Italian 250s. The Ducati 250 Mark III. The Ducati 250 Mark III was introduced in 1967. It was a single-cylinder, 4-stroke unit with bevel drives to a single overhead cam. The Mark III replaced the American market downer and its European counterpart, the Mark I. The Mark III used a dynamo with battery coil ignition, replacing the old magneto used on some earlier models. The engine used wider crankcases. These had first been designed by Fabio Taglioni for use on the 1967 Sport Corsa race models. The unit construction engine used an alloy head and barrel, but with a cast iron liner. Bore and stroke was 74 by 57.8, giving a displacement of 249 cc's. High compression pistons were used at 10:1. This gave a claimed power output of 30 horsepower for a top speed of around 90 miles an hour. A sportier version of the 3D was available, and this used of course DES Medtronic valves, something which Ducati are very famous for. It didn't really offer any great performance advantage over the conventional valve springs, although it certainly offers a lot of cachet value to modern buyers. Primary drive was by gears to a wet multiplate clutch and a 5-speed gearbox. Chain was of course final drive. The bike was fitted with a 29mm carburettor, and of course there was points ignition, although on later models, 73 onwards, electronic ignition was fitted. The bike was stopped by excellent drum brakes, although on very late 74 models these would be replaced by a single Brembo disc at the front. So with great styling, excellent performance and handling, it's easy to see why this bike has become something of a cult icon. But sales weren't that great at the time. The machine was expensive and didn't have the best reliability record either. And so despite its excellent competition record, the machine was withdrawn from sale by Ducati in 1974 to concentrate on their V-twins. The Perilla 250 GS. The Perilla 250 GS or Grand Sport was introduced in 1962 by the Perilla Motorcycle Manufacturing Company. This company had begun production in Italy in 1946 and had concentrated mostly on smaller capacity, mostly competition machines of between 50 and 250 cc's, with their most popular models being the 175cc bracket. The 250 Grand Sport used an air-cooled single-cylinder 4-stroke unit construction overhead cam engine. Bore and stroke was 68 by 68, giving a displacement of 247 cc's. There was battery coil ignition and a 28mm Delauto GP carburettor took care of the fueling. The makers claim that the 4-speed road-going bike produced 21 horsepower at 8,800 rpm, although competition models would claim rather more and would even boast a top speed of over 100 miles an hour. In competition trim, that is. This was undoubtedly a very beautiful and beautifully engineered motorcycle, but of course all these factors made the machine prohibitively expensive in most markets, so sales of the road bikes were very poor. As a result, the company would fold in 1967. The Airmi 250 Sprint. Airmi was, and indeed is, a major manufacturer in aviation in Italy. However, in 1951, With the factory at least partially standing idle, they decided to produce motorcycles, introducing their first machine, a scooter, that same year. And during the 1950s they produced large numbers of single-cylinder, two-stroke, small-capacity machines. However, in 1956 they introduced their first four-stroke model. This used an overhead valve, horizontally mounted engine in the truly bizarrely styled Chimera, which harked back to their earlier scooter models, having a lot of enclosed bodywork around the engine. In 57 more sporty models were introduced. These got rid of the odd bodywork of the Chimera and looked more conventional, but they still had that near horizontal engine. Also at this time, with sales of their scooters being rather poor, the company decided to concentrate solely on the production of conventional motorcycles. In 1960, American giant Harley Davidson purchased a 50% stake in the business, and that's why many of these machines will be badged as Airmi Harley Davidsons or just as Harley Davidsons in America. The 250 Sprint was introduced in 1961 and is often seen badged as a Harley Davidson. It ran the usual near horizontal 4-stroke single cylinder engine. This time it ran a 8.5 compression ratio engine with 18 horsepower being produced at 7,500 RPM. The little unit construction engine had been penned by former Perilla designer Alfredo Bianchi. The machine used a cast iron barrel with an aluminium head, fairly typical for sporting machines of the period. The machine ran a fairly high compression ratio of 9.2 to 1 for a claimed 30 horsepower at 9,800 RPM. This was then pushed to the back wheel for a 4-speed gearbox. The US magazine Cycle World tested the bike in 1962, of course then badged as a Harley Davidson. They found that like most singles there was some vibration at 55 to 60 miles an hour, but this would smooth out when you pushed on to say 70 miles an hour. During its production run the bike would gradually see slight increases in power, finally finishing around 25 horsepower, for a claimed top speed of around 80 miles an hour. Some will claim much higher performance, but this of course is for fully kitted race machines with full fairings. The machine would see considerable success as a competition model, and would be used in Grand Prix by Harley Davidson. It would eventually be replaced in racing at least by a 2-stroke alternative, and these would continue to give Harley Davidson Grand Prix success right into the 1970s. And as for the overhead valve 250 Sprint model, that would finally be deleted from production in 1968. The Gelera Netuno Sport. Gelera is one of the oldest names in motorcycle manufacturing, being established by Giuseppe Gelera in Milan in 1909. But the name had really become known, at least in the UK, by the racing exploits of Serafini in the late 1930s. His mount was a 4-cylinder supercharged 500cc bike. However, post-war compressors were banned, and the Italian manufacturers were restricted to the use of single-cylinder bikes only. For this reason, Gelera used the Saturno 500 bike and the Netuno 250 production machines for road racing. In principle, the Netuno was a scaled-down version of the earlier 500cc Saturno model. The earlier model having been introduced in the late 30s, the Netuno would arrive in 1946. The machine would use friction-damped rear swinging arm suspension and girder forks at the front. The girder forks in these machines had a great reputation, and Gelera were very reluctant to replace them with telescopic forks. Bound to fashion they would eventually do so, but found little improvement over their great girder design. The bike differed from its more conventional British opposition of the time in its use of wet sump lubrication and unit construction, although it was still an overhead valve engine. The machine produced 14 horsepower claimed at 6,000 RPM. This was fed through a 4-speed gearbox and would give a top speed of around 80 miles an hour, well claimed at least. But whatever the performance, the Netuno is a beautifully put together, very elegantly designed little motorcycle. The Benelli Riverside 250. Benelli is another one of those grand old names of Italian motorcycle manufacture, being established in Pesaro in 1911. By the late 60s the company was heavily involved in the American market, with Montgomery Ward selling the machines under the Riverside name. The machines would essentially arrive in a crate direct from Italy and then the owner would have to assemble it before taking it out onto the road. The bike used was a unit construction 245cc air-cooled 4-stroke overhead valve motor that made around 22 horsepower and put its power for a 4-speed gearbox. The chassis and suspension setup was fairly conventional by the standards of the time, although the engine was used as a stress member in the frame. There were of course drum brakes front and rear. The bike weighed in at 231 pounds, so top speed would have been around the 75 to 80 miles an hour bracket, although with those American style high bars, anywhere near highway speeds would have made for a fairly windy experience. The Benellis continued to be sold by Montgomery Ward throughout the late 60s. However, by that point, the influx of Honda was really killing off sales, the Benellis being seen as overhead valve and therefore rather old-fashioned. And then in 1971, Argentine businessman Alejandro de Tomaso acquired the company, and he would replace Benelli's single-cylinder overhead valve machines with an all-new range of Honda-based 4-cylinder bikes. What other collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Maybe you have a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.